Hi, welcome back to Educator.com's AP Music Theory course. Today's lesson is on voice leading. So the objectives for this lesson, before we get into connecting triads together, we're going to learn the voice ranges, and then we're going to look at the different types of voice motion that can occur between two or more voices. And then we're going to learn a little bit about chord spacings. And then we're going to look at actually some common voice leading errors based on the things we've covered before that in this lesson. Okay, so let's start with looking at the voice ranges. So we're going to be working in a four-voice style, which means that we'll have a soprano voice and an alto voice, and then a tenor voice, and a bass voice. And so it's pretty straightforward. For the soprano voice, you basically want to keep it somewhere, in this range from C to G. And then the alto voice, good idea to stay between G and D. And then for the tenor voice, octave below the soprano, so C to G. And then for the bass voice, sometimes you see it here from E to C, but of course it could go a bit lower than that. And of course these ranges overlap with each other, but we don't want the voices themselves to overlap, and we'll look at that when we get to the errors section. This isn't something that has to be memorized, but it's a good idea to keep it in mind, and you don't want any basically any extremes, like the soprano going way higher than its range or way lower. Okay, now let's look at the different kinds of voice motion. So the first kind of motion we can have when we are dealing with two voices, I'll just write two voices here. So what about if we've got, let's say, an A and a C. So we've got this third here. And if we say that these voices are moving in parallel to each other, it means that every step that, let's say, this bottom voice takes, so if this bottom voice takes a step down a second, that the top voice is going to make the same step down. So it'll take a second down, diatonically for both, of course. And what that means is that, let's say the bottom voice now moves up a fourth to C, that the top voice is also going to move up a fourth to E. And this results in the interval being consistent throughout. So this is a third, this is a third, this is a third, and you could call these parallel thirds. Similarly, if we start out with a sixth, like a C and an A, and let's say this moves down to B, and then to D, E, F, G. So that would mean that the A would move to G, B, C, D, E, and we can denote this with these lines. And we see that this is sixth, 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 sixth. So again, this is parallel motion by sixths. Okay, the next kind of motion we will look at is similar motion. So let's start out with that sixth that we just left from. So we had this C and an A. And let's say this time the C goes up to a D and the A goes up to an F. So similar motion means that the two voices are moving in the same direction but not by the same interval. So similarly, we can move this D back down to a C, and then this F down to this F down to a G. And this will give us another similar motion. Let's look at one more example of that. Or actually, let's contrast this. So we've got similar motion when the voices are moving same direction different interval. And then we can look at, not parallel, but we can look at contrary motion. So contrary motion is when the voices move against each other. So if up here we had this C, starting with this sixth again, C and an A, and the C moves up to the D, now the A needs to move in the opposite direction. So the C went up, so the A can move down to F, and then again, as this D moves down to C, now the F needs to move up, and let's say it moves up to C. Okay, and another kind of motion is oblique motion. So this is when one voice moves and the other stays the same. So for instance, let's take this same sixth again, and let's say that the C just stays on C, and the bottom voice moves to G, and then moves to F, and then ends on this nice third on E. So this is an example of oblique motion, and of course these could be tied or not, doesn't make a difference. So now let's look at some ways of spacing triads. So there's two different spacings that we can distinguish between. So when we're starting to look at connecting chords, it's important to know about open and closed spacing. So keeping our voice ranges in mind, let's see here. Let's start with a C major chord that looks like this. So we've got, in a four voice context, we want to double the root in these root position chords. So we've got a C, a G, a C, and another E, or another C and then an E. So this is an example of closed spacing, and I'll explain what that means. What it means is that between the upper three voices, there's no room to insert any other notes of the triad. So we've gone from this G, the next closest note of C major is C, and we've got a note there. And then from this C, the next closest note, part of a C major triad, is an E, and we've got that. So no space for chord tones. And if we were writing this C major in the three types of closed spacings, it would be this one here, and then this one here, and finally this one here. So we got the third on top, the root on top, and then the fifth on top. And if we cycle back down, we'll just have the third on top again. Similarly, going the other way. And so now let's look at open spacings. So as you may guess, in an open spacing between the upper three voices, there is space. So if we start with the C major chord again, and we write an E here, what that means is maybe we can leave this G open and double the C here, and now we need a G, which goes up here. So now this chord is an open spacing because we've left this E here and this G here not filled in. Let's do another open spacing. What about C major, starting with G here, and then we'll skip over the C and put an E here, and then we need the C up here. So this is two good examples of open spacing, and we'll be employing both of these types of spacings in when we start connecting chords to each other. Okay, so we've looked at different kinds of voice motion and then some issues of spacing and looked at ranges. So let's look at some common voice leading errors that might occur with these ideas in mind. So the first one is going back to the idea of parallel motion is parallel octaves. So we don't want voices that have the same note in an octave to move together in parallel. Whether it's for one beat or from, one note to another or three in a row, of course, like this. So, of course, it's easy to spot in two voices, but we'll be looking for this error when we're dealing with our four-voice chord connections. So this is parallel octaves. And similarly, we want to be careful of parallel fifths. So of course that would look something like this, maybe. So C to G, moving to F to C, maybe moving down to A to E. And of course it doesn't matter what interval the voices move by. What's important is that this is a fifth, this is a fifth, and this is a fifth. So the reason why these two are not desirable in voice leading is because we want to emphasize the individual character of each voices, and these perfect intervals moving in parallel don't really give that feeling. They sound like one voice is very subservient or kind of a shadow of the other voice. Let's look at another voice leading error that might have to do with spacing. So when we're writing our chords, let's see, spacing. Let's say we start with C, C, E, G. So here we've got the doubled root C, which is good, and then an E and G completing the chord. But the problem with this is that there's between the tenor and the alto, we've got interval of a tenth. And we don't want anything bigger than an octave between the upper three voices. So between upper voices, nothing greater than an octave. Of course, between the bass and the next highest voice, the tenor, it's okay. We could have, this A here, and then E, A, C to make an A minor triad, and this is fine. But between the upper voices, we don't want to leave these big holes in the sound. And so now that we're looking at triads a little bit, another issue we can look at is making sure we have completed chords. So maybe you'll get into a situation where you end up on a chord like this, C, C, G, C. And of course, this is supposed to be a C major chord, but there's no third. So we can call this an empty fifth. So this is an important thing to look for when you're connecting chords, is that make sure that you're taking care of all the notes in the next chord that you need. And the last thing to look at is, what about voice motion in terms of voices taking over other voices? So if we have, let's say, three voices here, so C, an E, and a G, and I'll put stems on these to make it more clear. So let's say the C moves down to an A, and then the E moves up to an A, oops, and I'll keep the stem down, and then the G moves down to a C. So not so important what's happening here with the chords, but what's important here is that this lower voice with the stem down, the alto in this case, has moved above the soprano. So this is called voice crossing. And it's another example of a voice leading error. So these are some things to keep in mind when we move on in the next lesson to connecting chords. So let's review with some examples. So let's say we are given two voices that are moving like this, and we are asked to describe what sort of motion this is, and of course this is parallel motion. And another example that we might encounter with these concepts is, let's see, this sort of motion. So we can review and we see that the bottom voice is moving down and the top voice is moving up, and then the top voice is moving down while the bottom voice is moving up. So this is, of course, an example of contrary motion. And then in another example, maybe we'll be asked to spot some sort of voice leading error. So what if we are given these two chords? So what's happened here is that the D has moved to the C, and so has the B. And so looking at these two chords, we can look for parallels and spacing problems, and we see that what we have here is an empty fifth because there's no E in this C major chord. And for the last example, let's do another spot the error chord progression. So what if we have this chord moving to this chord? So we can check to see we have all the right notes, F, A, C, and G, B, D. But the problem with this progression is, of course, that all the voices are parallel. So that gives us parallel octaves here. And it gives us parallel fifths here. All right, thanks for watching Educator.com's AP Music Theory course. See you next time.